So we are going to do, we don't have, the good news and bad news of not doing a full set per night. The good news is, I can go as long as, I got it. The good news is, I can, we can go over it, it doesn't matter, there's no press on time, so I don't have to talk really fast. And to try to squeeze something in. But what happens is every once in a while we get a night like tonight where there's probably not enough material to cover a full night. But I don't want to jump into the next one. So we're going to, we'll go back and do a little review tonight, and then we'll finish up. So, so we'll go back and, so if we were to describe what original creation is, what do we say original creation was?
6 days.
6 days, right? It's just how evangelical creation, God created the world in 6 days, creation museum, it's just that's the original creation. What's the other word? Classical creation is the other word you can use for that. It's just historically how that's been believed. All right, what is the gap theory?
Between Genesis 1:1.
All right, so Genesis 1:1, God creates everything. Genesis 2, he begins to put everything together. And there could have been millions of years in between there. And so it really, original gap theory was developed to kind of be a defense against the idea of evolution and the whole earth and all of that. And so, yeah, so that's really what the gap theory is. Relative beginning.
Day 1, first day is actually day 3.
Okay. Yeah, so it happens, and then you get to day 1's actually the third day of creation, and it rolls forward from there. Okay, finally, historical creationism. All right, now, this is the one y'all need to know.
And that's to do the land and sky, heavens and earth, land and sky.
All right, so the main thing to remember on historical, there you go. The main thing I want you to know about historical creationism is that the idea is that when we get to verse 2, that it is the preparation of the promised land. It's not that it's the first time that there's morning and day within the earth. It's just the first day that the spirit, the darkness is hovering over, and then got over that landmass for however long it's been. And then God takes special time to prepare the promised land. And when you look at the rivers of the Garden of Eden, there are some similarities between that and the rivers that are mentioned in, they're not completely alike, but there's similarity between those and the promised land. And the other big key phrase there is this, the actual word in the beginning, where we tend to think of that being an instant. When the world, almost like the Big Bang, where it's just an instant, that's where the world began. It's more this idea that it was in the beginning is an indefinite period of time, and it's never used to not mean a span of time. So part of the argument for historical creationism is that you have this in the beginning. Another part of that is where it says the land was formless and void. We talked about that. The idea is that the land was just basically uninhabitable, and so the idea was again the promised land was uninhabitable until God made it good and prepared it for His special people, which is in Genesis 12, Abraham, when that's going to become the promised land. And throughout the New Old Testament, we call it the promised land. It's actually never called that in the Bible. It's just called the land, because you know what we're talking about when we talk about the land. And so that's kind of all that. So all that is the idea of historical creation. The biggest thing is that you've got, so it's, I used to say it's not the same principle as a gap theory, but it's like a modified gap theory, because there could be a period of time between 1 and 2, verses 1 and 2, but there's not required to be. The other thing we did talk about, I'll mention again, with the creationism and the original creationism, you hear people talk about it could be a period of time for the word day. And when you look at the text clearly says evening and morning, the first day, second day, third day. It's a day. It's not a period of time. And the author went out of his way to make sure we understood there was no question that it was a day, 24-hour day. And so that's always important to remember, because it's, people talk about the day being there, but they don't mention the evening and sunrise on the end of that. So they don't mention the part that defines it as a day. They just like to stop it. Well, a day could be 1,000 years, yeah, but not with the evening, not with the sun rising and setting. So that's always important. The other key thing, just anytime you read the text through there, just remember there's create. God created. That's the idea, ex nihilo, out of nothing. But then there is make, and the majority of the things that we see in chapter 1 are actually made, not created. And so, for whatever that's worth. So just some things to note when you go through and are reading that. So tonight we're going to look at a couple of the big ideas. And I brought the book down, Creation and Blessing. I do not recommend this book. It's great. It's not because it's not one of my all-time favorite books, because it is a great, great book. But it's for preachers. Like a lot of books are like are not necessarily pastoral commentaries. This one is. I had a guy tell me before I went to seminary, I was talking to my pastor, First Baptist King, and he was over the newspaper in North Carolina at the time, and I happened to be at the table talking to him, and he said, you know, a good commentary. He goes, you need to go to a year or two of seminary just to be able to read a good commentary. You use just background knowledge and that kind of stuff. And that one's not quite that hard, but I'm not recommending it for lay people. But that being said, a lot of what I get that we'll use in our book of Genesis will come out of this book, because it's a guide to study and the study expedition. He does the best job of putting sermon ideas together of anybody I've seen going through Genesis. And so I will use that a lot. In fact, most of your sermon notes you'll notice down on the possible outline. I say possible because there are always multiple ways to outline a passage. So for a possible outline, those are going to be his probably every time, because he does such a good job. So I thought I'd just let you see the book. But unlike Genesis Unbound, but if you like reading about creation and the idea, just all that different detailed stuff, Selhammer writes in such a way that a layperson can understand that without any trouble. So that being said, there's a chart he does in his introduction on page 75 that I wanted to share with y'all. And so there is one correction to it on the first day on the second column. So we'll get to that in a second. So it's first day. So he just kind of summarizes the activity for each day. So what we want to do now, we've gone in and we've been looking at the words and the verbiage, and we've been looking at the trees. And so the golden idea is we want to pull back and look at the forest. You know, why now are we right? We've looked at all the details. We've kind of messed through those. Now, what's the big picture that we should learn from this? How does it impact our life? And so as we look back at it, day one, light was created and divided from darkness. Now, what does that mean to us if we think about it in theological terms? So revelation of God's goodness. So light does what? Revelation of God's goodness, separation from evil. So I left off the word evil. Not because I don't believe in evil, because I just forgot to type it in for some reason.
Evil thing to do.
It was an evil thing to do, that is correct. So that's the word there, is evil. And but that's the idea. So at the very beginning, you get this idea, and it does set this tone for the whole Bible. There's going to be this battle, light, dark, good, evil, that we're going to see. And so separation, light and day. Heaven divided from the waters. Again, the evil abyss, the deep, is kind of a picture of evil. The water and hovered over the water. The Spirit hovered over the water, hovered over the deep. And so that's verse 2. So that's the part of heaven. So that's divided. And again, separation of the evil, separation of good and evil is part of the theme there. The land appears for vegetation. So again, it talks about provision. There's provision for fertile land for all types of vegetation. So God provides for us. We think about God as creator. One of the key things to remember is God created a world that provides for what we need to live, and provides the sustenance for what we need to live. And in a variety, you know, easily, had God chosen to, I don't know if you ever thought about this. Probably not, because I think weird things. If God had chosen to, He could have made us live on manna. It's enough to sustain you. That's all we need, right? God could have just given us manna forever. But there are a variety of vegetables. There's a lot of different stuff that we eat. Some of them we probably shouldn't, but it's good. JD's talking about how the full refrigerator of food he likes, that's more than man, right? So even the idea that God gives us provides what we need, but in addition to that, he applies stuff that's pleasurable for us, I think is also worth considering. The luminaries designated to rule the times and seasons, right? So the greater day, the greater light in the day, dimmer light in the night. So again, it's a designation for appointing times and seasons for order and creation. How does that come into play? I want you to think biblically now. How does this idea of appointing times and season for ordering creation, how does that play out in the Bible? How do we see that manifest itself? Come on now. All right, what's this week?
Easter.
All right, Easter happened what week?
Passover.
Passover. God appointed seasons here, knowing that there's going to be a time for Passover, that there's going to be a time for the Festival of Booths, that there's going to be a time for the Festival of Weeks. And so God knew to order time, order seasons, and that was part of it. And how often does the Bible refer to this idea of seasons? The idea that God provides this. The fig doesn't, the fig tree has to produce fruit in its season. And so all of that, as these idea of appointed times and season and ordering of creation, so we think about all of that, that's all pointed to in day 4. And because the Israelites were given a calendar, right? It starts the first day, first month, you're supposed to celebrate the Passover. And then it goes through the rest of those. And so that whole idea, that's what I'm saying, everything that happens anywhere in the Bible, we're going to see in the first 11 chapters, and you can really argue in the first 3 or 4. It just really points to it, everything. Creation points to everything later in the Bible. Living creatures of the sea and air are created and are blessed, so that's the provision of blessing for all kinds of animal life.
Can I go back to
Sure.
day 4 and day 1? Day 1 light was created, day 4 luminaries designated. So day 1 light was created, but it wasn't the sun, or
It doesn't say. It just says that there was light. And so you don't get the greater light on day. It's always been kind of a weird, and so how to explain that, I don't know. There's always been that kind of period of time. So to be honest, that's why, if I ever moved away from a true 7-day creation like the classical view, I would go to historical creationism, because it would make sense that could happen, that you couldn't see it, and then you made it light there, and anyway, and then you do the sunlight. But anyway, there's no real easy way to explain that.
But the ruling of the times and the seasons has to do with how they move.
Yes.
I mean, the light could have been created on day 1, the sun could have been there, but it's their movement that creates the seasons.
Yeah. Well, and like creates tides too. Yeah. So.
Different seasons of planting in different, the grains depends on harvest at different times and stuff like that.
Yeah.
You're talking about different times for, pick the fruit and do this, that. But as you move back and forth on the earth, you have different types of seasons.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and
Oh, yeah.
the Bible deals with basically what happens within the Middle East usually, from what I can gather.
Yeah, well, that's who they're writing to. So all these things are written to people that grew up in the Middle East and Europe.
Right.
And so, so everything's going to be based more on that than it would be, and so, the spring or whenever but the concept of the idea that there are seasons. So Australia's seasons are the exact opposite of ours, right? So we think about spring's great because of the green, and Australia, they're dealing with the fall right now. And so all the stuff that we think is great about the fall, like the leaves color and change, well, that's Australia now. So they're in South America, because the seasons flip. The whole idea of just having those seasons is just overall the idea that God has put all those into place is the main thing that we're trying to. And He's going to write, and there's going to be stuff written about the seasons and about in everything that all fits together. It's not the only point, but it's just some of the ways to think about how the world's being put together.
Well, that's where civilization started, so it's going to have to be about.
It is actually interesting, a lot of the earlier maps, because now, pretty much now we all think of the map Western Hemisphere, Eastern Hemisphere, Eastern and Western Hemisphere, just kind of where the Western, so it goes that direction, and kind of how we look at maps of the world. But all ancient maps, especially during the time of Rome, when you looked at it, it's like the Mediterranean Sea and the Promised Land were at the middle, and everything moved around that. And so the whole perception of what the land is like was completely different. And
Where all the people started.
yeah, it's also very fascinating. Okay, I'm sure. You might ever watch the show The West Wing besides me.
What?
Yeah.
The show The West Wing.
Sure.
There's a fascinating, I don't know if you remember, they had that day when you come to the White House and bring up topics. And it really is interesting that our maps, because they did a whole scientific thing on one of the episodes, and our maps are actually not necessarily always great predictions of what, our depictions of what it actually looks like, and a lot of it's slanted based on culture and that kind of stuff, the way we make some stuff bigger, some stuff smaller. It's a fascinating episode. Because they went into it, it's like, they gave like on this TV show, they gave like 10 minutes to that topic, which is kind of interesting. But yeah, the ancient maps actually used to center around, the Middle East was the center of a lot of
So in
stuff.
other words, the Bible, in a great extent, is written based on what happens in the Middle East.
They didn't go outside.
I would be careful to limit it to that. What you're saying is right, but I would be careful in how I said that, because it would be very easy to take that and then say, well, what does it matter to the rest of the world if it's centered on the Middle East? So granted, you're right, but that's where civilization was. I mean, the only people living were in the Middle East, and population expanded out from there. And the great empires of the ancient world were there. And quite honestly, the Bible is a history primarily of the Jewish nation, not even specifically the Middle East, as much as the Jewish nation, because that's the promise of God through Abraham, and that's what everything revolves around. So you're right, everything's about that. That's also because it's your focus is on the Israelites. All right. Then you get day 6, land, animals created and blessed, human life created, blessed, commissioned to have dominion. And so it's the provision of the blessing for all kinds of animal life, provision of human life, blessings, fertility and dominance over creation. And we do have responsibility to manage the environment. We should be good stewards of the environment, and we should do things to enhance the environment, not to hurt it. And then completion of creation, 7th day, designation of the 7th day, provision of sanctifying and theocratic rest. Again, God didn't rest because He had to. God rested because we need to. And this idea, and I like the fact that it's theocratic rest. There's this idea that part of the idea of resting is actually being in God's presence. It's not just rest, let's go play golf, let's go fishing, let's sleep in the bed. It's the idea of there's a day to worship and be with God. And it's not specific to the Sabbath, right? Because we don't worship on the Sabbath. We actually celebrate resurrection every Sunday, because that's why we worship the day we do. The church started worshiping on resurrection, the day of the resurrection. And so that's what the early church would worship. But it's the concept of we need a day. Our bodies do better when we rest. And again, Western culture, I was eating lunch with John MacArthur, pastor at First Pres, a few weeks ago. And he lived in Italy for a while. He said one of the biggest differences between here and Europe is when you eat. Because as Americans, for the most part, we eat to eat so that we can get to whatever's next on the agenda. And he said in Italy, it ain't that way. You're eating for 2 or 3 hours at night. It's just, when you go to a restaurant, 3 hours. Just don't plan anything else that night, because that's where you're going to be. And they take more time. The idea of siesta in the afternoon, right? We as Americans, I know growing up as American, the way it was always taught, never said directly, always implied, that this idea of an afternoon nap is actually, kind of laziness, because we're supposed to be grinding. By the way, I know it came out, it was 1987 when it came out, because they did a scientific study and said, actually, if you would take a 1 hour siesta, rest in the afternoon, it actually is better for your body. And we try to convince our bosses, and others don't know this, because we try to convince our bosses at Cherry Becker and Holland that we needed an hour rest in the afternoon, that we would be more productive, and they didn't go for it. But there is actually scientific evidence that you're actually better off. But we, again, American culture is, we grind. And, but we do need to rest.
It was called a power nap.
Power nap, that's right.
When I was in Spain, they would have a siesta in the afternoon because it was so hot.
Yep.
But they were walking the streets and everything to midnight. The businesses were open.
And they didn't eat till 9 or 10 o'clock.
Yeah, that's true. 8, 9, 10.
All right, so that's kind of just a way to theologically look at the things. And then on the possible outline for Genesis 1, 2, and 3, again, there's the introduction, title, God created the universe, circumstances, the Spirit of God ensured salvation in the darkness. And so that's kind of how he groups those first 2 verses together. I thought this was interesting. The reason I included this actually was what it does for the development. That there were 3 days that God brought order and form. So right, so it's the first 3 days are basically about setting up what's going to go in it. Right, it's setting up. You got the light that's got, so all that. The first 3 days are the setup. There's order and form, right? Because we talked about being voidless and form. So he puts into place where you're going to put stuff, and then he begins to deal with and does fullness and harmony in the last 3 days. And so I thought that was really interesting to divide creation up that way. It's kind of like when you look at the 10 Commandments. The first 4 commandments deal with what?
Worship God.
Yeah, deal with vertical relationship with God. Commandments 5 through 10 deal with what? Horizontal relationships with each other. And so you kind of got that division in the 10 Commandments. You see kind of the division here and how it was put together. So I thought that was kind of interesting to look at it that way. And then by the 7th day, God had completed his creative work, and then God blessed and sanctified the 7th day and ceased to work, again with that idea of a Sabbath being in there. So that is basically creation, Genesis 1:1 through 2:3. Any questions? Or any other questions?
Can you expand and review this about the created made? What were you referencing when you said pay attention to what was created and what was made?
All right, so there's only 3 times. I think it's 3 times that the word "create" is actually used. It's create. In the beginning, God created the heavens, and they are created. He created man, and I think he created the sea creatures of all things. So 2 of those don't make sense to me, and I've never understood the sea creature part. I think it's sea creatures.
Yes.
Yes.
It is sea
Verse
creature.
21.
Okay. I was thinking that was right. So there's only 3 times. So everything else is made. So that the implication is that creation is out of nothing, out of something. Now, he did create out of dust, man. So he gave life to dust. So that's a create there. That's why the sea creature thing I still don't understand how to explain that. I need to go back and read my commentary on that. But the idea is that then you get to this whole idea of then. So what's he making? What did he make out of? So the idea of making something is you exist. He created the heavens and the earth. Now he's making all this stuff out of what's already been created. And that's part of, we talked a little bit about the mud, I'm always scared to bring it up again, the mud ball theory. That it's like basically like you create just this ball, and then it still haven't called it the mud ball theory. And so this idea of, and that real much is very much the gap theory. You got like this mud ball, and then all of a sudden now God pulls light out of it, and he pulls this out of it, he pulls this out of it, and all of a sudden that's how, he makes out of it and starts to make stuff from that. But there is very much a difference between the idea of create and make. And the word most of the time is that he made, not that he created. And so that, why would we often use make instead of create? Well, we so often say create, like, day 2 created, like, well, we made. And so that's.
So don't you think also, and I know God told Moses what to write. I mean, I understand that. But don't
That's a
you-
whole other story, we won't go into all
Okay,
that.
don't go into that today. But my thought process, and always teaching this to kids, and I've taught, little guys through 5th and 6th grade, and that was as tall as I got in Sunday school. But to me, these are the words that give us the information we need to believe what God has done. But I do not think that we as human individuals can understand the greatness of God. And if we could really understand this text, we would have the mind of God. We don't.
Well, but God also wrote it to reveal to us to understand. So, I mean, He wants us to understand and create. That's where the challenge comes in, is just trying to figure that out and why it's written the way that it is. And that's where, again, Genesis Unbound by Dr. Selhammer is a great book. And one of the criticisms was that he was too close to the text. Because one of the things he really talks about, and it's what we should do with every passage, is remember that the passage was written, in this case, to Jews that are getting ready to enter the promised land. I mean, that's when he writes it, right? So, what did it mean to the Jews that are getting ready to enter the promised land? How would they have understood it? And that's like, and we went into a lot, but like the idea that we use heavens and earth very much deals with the Greek concept of creation, more so than what would have been the Hebrew mindset. And the better interpretations of those words, and we would read it different. If we read it, if it said, in the beginning God created the sky and the land, we would have a different mentality of it. Because when we say heavens and earth, we think of heaven's spiritual stuff, earth down here. At least I do. And I think most people do. You think heavens, you think of just more, and basically it was just saying, hey, the sky, God created, the land, God created. And then it comes back and talks about the water, God did that too. And so it's trying to go back to what the original text said and what would it have meant to the first people that read it, not filtered through. And even the Septuagint, because it was in the Greek language, the words that they chose that would imply heavens and earth would be more based on the Greek mindset of how they were created.
Astrology.
Yeah. Well, not astrology as much as just the whole, the philosophical, it's more the philosophical of gods and forms and that type of thing that would have impacted. And so so his whole goal in that book is to unpack the text, looking at it the way a Hebrew would in 1500 BC rather than we would modern day, or the way even the Greeks and the Septuagint later on 300, 500 BC would have done. So it's interesting stuff. But the key goes back to the big key, big picture is God created, and then again, the whole deal is if God created the heavens and the earth, even secular people know that we are accountable to God. And that's the biggest thing. And even, you know, and for me, I think the other side of it is, I think one of the key concepts of understanding God is the sovereignty of God. And part of the, you know, sovereignty is not, you know, so God creates it, but now He also controls it. And the idea that you make it, you're the one that's able to fix it. The illustration I use the most a lot of times is, so when I started as director of accounting at Radford, the big thing you have to figure out, the biggest thing you have to figure out in finance at a hospital is how much money are you going to collect? All right, so if Medicare, if we bill a patient $1,000, Medicare is going to pay so much, Blue Cross is going to pay so much, self-pay means no pay. I mean, you collect like 2% of self-pay bills, hospitals like 2% collection, it's ridiculous. Because everybody has insurance, and people can't afford insurance, can't afford hospital bills, it's just the way it is. So that's what you have to figure out. And so, but I had to figure out was, okay, how much do we think we're going to collect from Medicare? So there's a way to figure that out per bill. Then you got to figure out this thing called cost reports, which basically is a hospital tax return. How much are we going to get on our, you know, how much are we going to owe, how much are we going to pay on our cost reports? Tax returns. So you got to try to guess, not guess, but try to estimate what that's going to be. And then you got to do the same thing with Blue Cross and your other insurances. At the time, it was simple because there was only a few insurance companies. And then you had to do the same thing for Medicaid. What are we going to pay for our Medicaid patients? So it's called contractual adjustments. Well, my boss figured out this worksheet to help figure this out. And I would have to go in, and when I first started, all I did was plug in numbers because he made the spreadsheet. He created it. And I just plugged in numbers from the reports that he told me to plug in. I didn't know how it worked. Over the course of time, I was doing this every month. I began to understand, oh, this is what a cost report is. Oh, this is why we're going to collect 84% of this. This is why we're going to collect this. And I began to understand that. So I changed the spreadsheet completely. And so then it was my spreadsheet. Right now it's the spreadsheet I created because everything's mine now. And when I went to Stokes Reynolds, I had to teach this lady named Rhonda Mitchell, how to do it. And so I gave her my spreadsheets. And all she knew was what? How to plug in numbers. And I had to tell her, these are formulas in specific places, don't put a number there. And I made it a different color. Only put a number where blue is, if it's or black is. Don't put numbers where there's colors. And she didn't always remember. And then it just blew the whole thing up. But again, because I was the one that created it, or when Mike created his spreadsheet, you know how to operate and maneuver, manipulate it, and make changes. It's yours. And that's God's sovereignty. It's His world. And we might come in and we might have control over a little bit. We might be able to plug some stuff in. But it's God's world. And that's the most important thing. And I'll be honest with you, I did that 2-year Bible reading plan. I did a Bible reading plan last year, and I'm doing kind of a different one this year. I spread out Psalms, so I'm slowing down in Psalms, and I'm slowing down in some other areas. Because I'm only going through the New Testament once this year, and I'm only going to get through the Old Testament once, so I broke it down into smaller pieces. And when I do my devotion time, I'll just be honest, so I always try to make a comment on the passage, because to me, if I'm going to get something out of the passage, I got to write it down. I mean, if I'm not making myself write it down, I'm not going to remember anything. I mean, I'm not going to remember much anyway, but just any kind of impression. I'm just, the way I'm wired, I got to type it out. And so much as I would try to prepare a message, I try to do this every day, not prepare a message, but just the format's the same. What did it mean? What's the principle about God? And then how do I apply it to my life? And that's the two, it's just 3-4 lines. Every passage I read starts with, what did I learn about God? When I learned that about God, taking the text, what does that mean I have to do in my life? And it is amazing to me, this year in particular, because I read a thing, don't make stuff moral of story. What does it tell me about God, not me? I'm the application. And when you do that, when you study a passage, start there. What's the principle about God? Then what's the moral? So we try to go moral story first. Principle, what does it tell me about God? Then how do I apply it? And what's the moral? But that's the moral is the application. Principle's about principle's always about God, not us. It is amazing how many times this year I've typed, God is sovereign. It might be a song, it might be creation, but it is absolutely amazing how much in Scripture, when you really slow down and think, what does this passage tell me about God? That it's telling me, God is sovereign. God's the one in control of my problems. God's the one in control of my world. God's in control of everything. And it all starts because He created the world. And the one that creates it gets to make the rules. By the way, we get to make the rules for our kids' life. We create.
Well, I know 2 little girls that don't get that concept. I kind of thought mine got a little bit better, but I think it's called gentle
Somebody else.
That's right.
That's right. That's right. You're not the parent there. You're the grandparent. So anyway, but that's the deal. It's that same. I'm just telling you. When you look close, I'm convinced of this more and more all the time. There's only about 5 to 7 major themes in the Bible, and you probably can sum up every theme of the Bible in 4 parts, and they're all in Genesis, by the way. Creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. All promised in Genesis. They don't all happen in Genesis. But every bit, it's creation. That's it. God created the world. Fall. Relationship is broken. So every passage you read, some aspect of creation, some aspect of redemption, some aspect of the ultimate recreation, or some aspect of the fall is going to be at the heart of, God is, that's the other thing, by the way. I write God is just. Between 3 passages, I don't know that a morning goes by that I don't write God is sovereign and God is just. It's really hard to, it's just right there all the time. So, anyway, that's the big part of the creation. Any other questions?
Do you think Satan fell after 131?
No.
When do you think he fell?
Before, I think
Okay, I just,
in the gap between 1 and 2.
okay.
Well, no, to be honest, he could have fallen any time after, in the beginning, God created it, whenever, there's no way of knowing. I do not believe, so I will say this, let me rephrase it, I don't know when he fell, I just know that I am convinced, and I will never be convinced otherwise, that Satan fell before, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. I know a lot of people believe that. I don't believe it was God in the spiritual world. I do take it as a miracle, when God created the heavens and the earth, that he created everything. And so it was within that Satan was created.
That's what chapter 2, verse 1 says, that thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their hosts.
Well,
So essentially, they're saying everything was created.
Everything's created, yeah, everything's created in 1:1 to 2:3. And then, but I do not believe that Satan was created. I know even the children's story Bible when he was growing up used to say, I think it's funny, I argued with stuff I read when I was 5 years old. I've been prepared to argue my whole life. And I remember us reading the children's Bible when I was in first and second grade, and they said that Satan was created, that the children's study Bible, because I'm telling you, that's a very common in study Bibles, that Satan was created before in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And when I was 5 years old, I didn't believe it. And I've never read something that's changed my mind in almost 61 years, 55 years since then. So I feel fast to that. There's a lot of other stuff I've changed my mind on, but not that one. Very good. Any others? You get a short night tonight. The other advantage to me doing it that way is occasionally you get a short night. So I want to spoil you. I don't give you too many. I used to tell that to my students at CCBS. I was like, man, you pay to come to class. I want you to have your full class. I don't want to let you out early. What does every student say? No, please let me out early, right? And there's one class, the Book of Acts was actually the worst, because again, the Book of Acts is loaded at the beginning and the back end, not as much stuff to dig into. And so near the end of the class, you get off early a little bit more often. And one used to always give me a hard time. He's like, I can't believe you let people out early. I'm like, it's the Book of Acts. And I kept them late early, so we make it work. Anyway, all right, last chance, any questions? All right, let's pray. Dear God, we again come before you to praise you because you are our creator. And within that creation, you made a way to redeem us. And Lord, then you sustain us through eternity. And so, Lord, we thank you for that. And we thank you that we will always be in your presence when we die, because we don't die if we know you. We thank you for that promise. And Lord, again, just ask that you would bless us as we leave, especially during this Easter season. Give us opportunity to talk about Easter and the resurrection of Jesus with people who don't know you, and invite somebody to church. It's in the name of Jesus Christ we pray. Amen.